You're not stuck. You're simply observing the same reality, with the same eyes, the same filters, the same emotions. What you call being stuck might not be an external standstill, but rather an internal repetition disguised as movement. A subtle loop where, despite everything you do, you think you're making progress, but you always return to the same emotional place. Maybe no one ever told you this, but there's a part of the mind that doesn't want anything new. It wants safety. And for it, safety means repetition, even if it hurts, even if it suffocates, even if it silences your soul. Because repeating what's familiar feels safer than facing the unknown of real change. And so you shift into autopilot. You notice what's wrong, feel the same frustration, think the same thoughts, and without realizing it, you send the same vibration to the universe as you did yesterday. Have you felt this before? As if your life were on an invisible treadmill. Your arms move, sweat drips, the effort is real, but the scenery never changes, and guilt whispers, maybe I'm the problem? No, the problem isn't you. The problem is your focus, what you keep choosing to observe, because what you frequently observe becomes your frequency, and what becomes your frequency turns into the pattern of your reality. Today, we're going to dismantle this distorted mirror. We're going to reveal the hidden mechanism behind the feeling of stagnation. Because when you change what you choose to observe, with presence, with intention, with awareness, reality has no choice but to change too. That is the key, and it's already in your hands. There is a silent frustration that many carry, the feeling of trying, striving, searching, and yet still feeling stuck in the same place, as if something is wrong with you, as if you're lacking effort, focus, or faith. But what if the problem isn't in how much you do, but in what you keep observing internally? There is a deep difference between external movement and internal transformation. You can move to a new house, a new city, get a new job, start new projects, read books, watch videos, seek answers. But if your field of observation remains fixed on the same pains, the same judgments, the same voids, then all of that becomes just a new version of the same prison. It's the illusion of progress. Like a gym treadmill, your muscles move, but you stay in the same place, not due to lack of strength, but because the ground you're walking on is circular. This is the hidden dilemma of many souls on a journey, the exhaustion of doing so much, and not seeing the vibrational reflection of that in real life, because the universe doesn't respond to effort, it responds to frequency, and frequency is largely shaped by your lens of observation. What you chronically focus on, what you notice the most, talk about the most, fear the most, or reject the most, becomes the mirror reality uses to respond to you. The mind by nature is selective. It doesn't show the world as it is, but as you've gotten used to seeing it. It filters, it distorts, it confirms what it already believes. That means if you carry within you a belief in lack, the mind will look for evidence of it everywhere. If you expect rejection, you'll interpret others' silence as disdain. If you fear failure, you'll unconsciously sabotage yourself just to avoid the risk of disappointment later. This mechanism isn't rational. It's vibrational, subtle, and deeply repetitive. And that's exactly why changing only the external almost never solves it. Because the origin of the reality you live in isn't in the circumstances. It's in how you perceive those circumstances. Perception precedes form, always. What most people don't realize is that this internal repetition has a pattern, a hidden script. It's as if there's a source code operating behind every decision, every emotion, every thought. And this code is old. It was formed by past experiences, painful memories, words you heard and believed. It was fed by traumas, rejections, comparisons. And over time, it turned into an almost invisible lens. You see the world through it, but think you're seeing the world as it is. This is the breaking point, realizing that what seems like stagnation isn't lack of action, but an excess of perceptual repetition. The body moves, the heart beats, but the field of observation remains stuck on the same references, the same voids, the same version of self. That's why many live as if inside a labyrinth. At each corner, the hope of finding an exit. but in the end, they always return to the same place. Not because there are no doors, but because the eyes are conditioned to see only the same walls. That's called conditioning, and it's more emotional than mental. Because even when you try to think differently, if the root emotion is still vibrating with old pain, the body still vibrates the same reality. This is an uncomfortable truth, but a deeply liberating one. The feeling of being stuck doesn't mean your life is at a standstill. It simply means you're still observing everything through the eyes of your old self. Real change begins when observation changes, when the lens changes, when you allow yourself to see what was always there, but your inner field wasn't ready to receive. Until that happens, you can change the environment, your habits, your relationships, but you'll still carry the same cloudy sky inside. And life, as a compassionate reflection, will simply repeat that sky in the landscapes around you. Not as punishment, but as a mirror. A mirror that doesn't judge, it just reflects. And in reflecting, it invites you to awaken. Reality isn't solid, it's malleable, vibrational, shaped by how you observe it. But here's the key point. Your observation is not neutral. It carries frequency. It carries intention, emotion, memory. And what you observe frequently, inevitably, turns into a silent command, a kind of non-verbal prayer that the universe responds to with absolute precision. Think of your attention as a beam of light. Wherever it touches, something gains strength. Something is nourished. Something begins to take form. If that beam of light constantly shines on lack, conflict, fear, then reality will, with extreme fidelity, return more experiences that confirm that focus. Not out of cruelty, but out of resonance. The universe doesn't listen to words. It listens to vibrational states. There is an energetic logic behind this, a kind of subtle algorithm. Everything you feed with your repeated observation resonates with your field, and everything that resonates with your field is magnetized back into your life. Repeated observation therefore creates a vibrational cycle, and that cycle becomes concrete reality, events, people, situations that reflect exactly what you've been reinforcing, perhaps unknowingly. Modern science is starting to acknowledge this principle. Neuroscience shows that when the brain repeats certain synaptic connections, it strengthens neural pathways, and those pathways become automatic patterns of perception and response. This means that constantly observing the same things, the failures, the mistakes, the fears, not only affects your mood, but literally rewires your nervous system to confirm those focus points. The brain begins to specialize in finding what you fear most, not out of malice, but out of efficiency. Now imagine this not just on a mental level, but a vibrational one. Imagine that each recurring thought is like a song you play every day, an emotional playlist. If that playlist is made up of lack, doubt, comparison, anxiety, then that becomes the dominant tone of your field. And if that vibration remains day after day, year after year, life begins to feel predictable, cyclical, limited. Not because life is that way by nature, but because you keep pressing the same play. You're replaying through your attention the same emotional story, and the universe, being a vast mirror of consciousness, simply continues delivering the same chapters. This explains why so many people feel like their lives are stuck in repeating patterns, different relationships, same conflicts, different jobs, same dissatisfaction, different pursuits, same emptiness in the end. Observation is like a magnet. It doesn't attract what you want, it attracts what you're already emitting. And what you emit is largely determined by where your attention most frequently rests. This means that as long as you keep observing through the same emotions, your field will keep vibrating in tune with the past. And when the field vibrates in the past, reality can only repeat what's already been. It's an almost hypnotic cycle. Old emotion activates old thought reinforces old focus returns old reality. And so, even if you try to change something on the outside, what manifests continues to be a disguised version of the old. That's why so many attempts at change fail, because they change the scenery, but not the lens. They try to alter the destination, but remain tuned to the same original frequency. It's like wanting to hear a new song, but refusing to change the radio station. No matter how much you wish for something new, if your vibration doesn't shift, the signal you send out stays the same. The good news is, this cycle, though powerful, is not unchangeable. It can be interrupted, but not with brute force, with conscious presence. The key lies in changing your point of observation, not trying to force reality to be different, but shifting how you perceive it. Because when perception changes, vibration changes. And when vibration changes, you tune into a new reality. It all begins with an almost imperceptible choice, to pause for a few moments and ask honestly, what am I really observing all the time? What am I chronically focused on? What stories am I telling myself when no one is watching? These questions aren't theoretical, they're doorways. And when opened with sincerity, they begin to dissolve repetition. Because what is observed with new awareness no longer vibrates in the old pattern. And when that happens, reality must, inevitably, begin to respond differently. There is a cycle that almost no one notices, yet it silently governs how you live, feel, and interpret reality. This cycle begins with an emotion, moves through a thought, and ends in a focus. And when it repeats unconsciously, it becomes the invisible engine of a life spinning in circles. It all starts with an emotional state. It could be frustration, anxiety, guilt, or a vague feeling of inadequacy. This emotion doesn't appear out of nowhere. It was built over time through undigested experiences, unspoken words, unmet needs. But even without an apparent cause, it vibrates. And that emotional vibration is the foundation for everything else. From that emotion, the mind begins to produce thoughts that resonate with the emotional state. For example, if the predominant emotion is fear, the thoughts tend to revolve around threat, scarcity, and mistrust. If the emotion is sadness, the mind brings up memories of loss, loneliness, and failure. This is not rational. It's automatic. Thought arises from the emotional ground where consciousness rests. And the more intense the emotion, the more thoughts align themselves to justify it. Then, with thoughts aligned to a dense emotion, you begin to focus only on parts of reality that confirm that narrative. It's like placing a dark filter over your lens of perception. Everything takes on the same tone. You enter a kind of hypnotic state. You can no longer see what is outside that emotional field. Opportunities are ignored. Synchronicities go unnoticed. Small miracles become invisible. And without realizing it, you confirm to yourself that nothing changes, that life is hard, that there's no point in trying. But what's happening isn't an objective truth. It's just the cycle in motion. Emotion feeds thought. Thought reinforces focus. Focus sustains reality. And reality feeds the emotion back. This is the loop. And it's deep. That's why so many people feel defeated even while trying to think positively. Because thought alone isn't enough if the root emotion is still vibrating scarcity, fear, or abandonment. You can repeat affirmations, make gratitude lists, visualize goals. But if your emotional body is still frozen in old memories, your field keeps emitting the same frequency. And the universe, sensitive to vibration, returns the same kind of experience. This explains why positive thinking works for some but not for others. When it comes from an authentic emotional state, it has creative power. But when it's used as a mask over an unbalanced inner field, it becomes disguised resistance, an attempt to hide the pain without healing it. And pain doesn't disappear when it's denied. It just manifests in another form. True transformation begins when this cycle is brought into awareness, when you realize that emotion is the starting point, that there's no use trying to think differently if you don't feel differently, and that it's not possible to change focus if you're still stuck in the same emotional landscapes as always. That's why the most honest question is not, what do I want to experience? But rather, what emotion am I feeding every day without noticing? This recognition doesn't require judgment. It requires presence. It requires the courage to feel without identifying, to observe without reacting, to welcome without fleeing. Because when emotion is recognized with compassion, it loses strength. And when it loses strength, the thoughts that stemmed from it begin to dissolve. And when thoughts become less dense, focus can open. And with new focus, a new reality begins to take shape. It's not about forcing anything. It's about releasing what no longer makes sense. It's about stopping the internal repetition of the same story. Because the universe doesn't move when you try to control. It moves when you allow. When you let go of the struggle and choose to see with a clearer lens. Today, maybe this is your moment. The moment to look within and realize, what cycle is feeding me without my awareness? What old emotion still commands my thoughts? What landscape do I insist on observing, even knowing it no longer reflects who I am? If this reflection touched something in you, like this video as a gesture of presence, and write in the comments with total sincerity, I release the cycle, I choose to feel differently. This simple statement is not just a comment, it's a vibrational commitment to your new path. Because when you affirm this with your heart, the cycle begins to break, and a new space begins to be born. There comes a moment on the path when you realize nothing that truly needs to change is actually outside of you. And this realization, though simple, is revolutionary. Because up until now, your mind has convinced you that internal discomfort would be resolved through external change. If something's missing, it must be money. If there's pain, someone caused it. If there's stagnation, it's because the world isn't cooperating. But what if all of that is just a reflection of what's vibrating within? The great turning point begins when you understand that you don't need to move mountains. You need to change the lens. And this lens is not a concept. It's a vibrational state, an emotional field that colors your interpretation of the world. When that lens is one of lack, you see deficiency in everything. When it's fear, you perceive threat in every silence. When it's rejection, everything seems like a sign of exclusion. But when the lens opens to gratitude, something shifts. Not outside, inside. Gratitude here is not a technique. It's not about forcing appreciation. It's about beginning to recognize, with honesty, what is already working, even amidst chaos, even when everything feels difficult, because there's always something pulsing with life. A gesture, a lesson, a space. Gratitude changes the lens because it realigns the vibration. And when the vibration changes, observation changes. And when observation changes, reality rearranges itself to reflect that new presence. It's at this point that the game changes. You begin to notice that, before anything materializes, there's an internal field organizing everything. That field is your state of being, and it doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you sustain. In other words, it's not your desire that creates reality. It's your alignment with that desire that makes it possible. It's your vibrational coherence that opens the way. So changing reality without changing anything on the outside is, in truth, a return to the source where everything begins. The vibration you emit simply by existing. When you allow yourself to choose to observe with new eyes, without resisting what is, the field opens. And often, what seemed stuck begins to flow. Not because you solved the problem, but because you exited resistance mode. And it's the absence of resistance that allows flow. Life wants to flow through you, but it doesn't invade. It waits for you to dissolve the inner walls, waits for you to stop identifying with old emotions, waits for you to remember that you don't need to control everything. You only need to be present, whole, honest about what you feel, because it's that honesty that dissolves the blockages. It's what clears the lens. In that place of presence, even challenges take on new meaning. You begin to see patterns where before you saw bad luck. You start seeing invitations where before you saw punishment. And most importantly, you begin to trust. Trust that the universe isn't punishing you, it's mirroring you. Trust that the pauses, the waiting, the silences are not punishments, but subtle reorganizations that ask for your non-resistance. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to rush. You don't need to become anything more. You only need to let go of the old focus, the old filter, the old story. And this doesn't require effort, it requires choice. Choosing to see what's already working, choosing to appreciate what already exists, choosing to feel what already vibrates within as a new beginning. And sometimes that beginning doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with lightness, with a small relief in your chest, with a silent tear from someone who finally understands they don't need to fight so hard, that they can trust, that they can observe differently, and by observing differently, begin to live differently. This is the silent miracle of true change. It doesn't begin with achievement. It begins with surrender, with a new posture before the same reality. And in that new posture, what once seemed fixed begins to dissolve, and what once seemed impossible begins to reveal itself. The world outside may remain the same, but when the lens changes, everything changes, because it's not reality that's stuck. It's the way you observe it that keeps repeating the same paths. Change the observation, and reality realigns, naturally, subtly, inevitably. Now that you've understood the depth of the cycle between observation and reality, it's time to bring this awareness into your daily life. Because as important as intellectual understanding may be, it's practice that creates transformation. And for that transformation to be real, it must begin in the only place where everything originates, your attention. Changing what you observe is not an intellectual effort. It's a vibrational training. It requires presence, conscious repetition, and an honest willingness to look at your own attention habits. Because focus is not just a voluntary act. Often, it's programmed. It's automatically drawn to what was registered as threat, pain, or lack. And that's why, even when you want to see things differently, you keep finding yourself observing the same things, the same flaws, the same problems, the same absences. The proposal now is to begin a process of vibrational re-education, and it starts with a simple yet deeply revealing exercise. For 3 days, you will be invited to observe what you observe. Yes, that's right. The practice is not about immediately changing your focus, but becoming aware of where your attention naturally rests. Because only what is seen can be transformed. During this period, instead of trying to control thoughts or emotions, simply take note. Observe, with neutrality, which themes dominate your field of attention. Do you think more about what's missing or what's already present? Does your mind look for mistakes or signs of beauty? Do you focus on conflict or on possibility? This self-observation in itself is already a pattern breaker, because it takes you out of automatic mode and returns you to the seat of presence. In the second part of this exercise, you begin to introduce a new observation code. And this is where the power of conscious intention comes in. Whenever you notice that your attention has been hijacked by an old pattern, criticism, comparison, fear, judgment, take a brief pause, breathe, acknowledge the pattern, but don't identify with it. Then say, internally or softly aloud, "Today I choose to observe with new eyes." This phrase is not a magic mantra. It's a reminder, a realignment. It doesn't deny what you felt, but it also doesn't allow you to stay stuck in the repetition. It opens a crack in the cycle. And it's in that crack that transformation happens. Over time, you'll notice something subtle. Reality begins to respond to your new posture. Small details, once ignored, become visible. You start to notice more synchronicities, signs, silent responses from the field. Not because the world has changed, but because your observation has changed, and the field always responds to your point of presence. This exercise also invites honesty, because it will reveal patterns you may not want to see. It will show how much you still observe what hurts, how much you still feed the old identity, and above all, how much it's possible to change that, not by force, but simply by choosing not to sustain what no longer vibrates with who you're becoming. This practice, though simple, has a cumulative effect. The more you repeat it, the more your neural and vibrational field reorganizes. The mind starts to understand that it can choose new paths. The body begins to respond with more lightness. The old emotion starts to lose strength, and little by little, the world around begins to reflect this new stability. The reprogramming of observation is, therefore, a return to the silent power of choice. Not intellectual choice, but energetic choice. The choice to be present enough to decide where to rest your attention. Because where your attention rests, that's where your reality begins to take shape. So for the next 3 days, make this commitment to yourself. Observe what you observe. And whenever you notice that you're repeating the old gaze, pause, breathe, and say with loving firmness, "Today I choose to observe with new eyes." You don't need to change the world. You only need to change the way you look at it. And when that happens, everything that seemed out of place begins to find a new alignment. Not because you forced it, but because you repositioned yourself. You stopped reacting and started choosing. This is true reprogramming. Not denying what you feel, but consciously transitioning to a new field of perception. A field where life speaks to you again, where time slows down, where reality reorganizes not through force, but through frequency. And it all begins with a choice, a new observation, a new way of seeing. Most people live waiting for a big change, something that happens on the outside, clearly, concretely, definitively. As if a new job, a new relationship, a striking event would finally break the cycle of stagnation. But real transformation doesn't come like that. It doesn't shout, doesn't invade, doesn't impose. It whispers. And almost always it happens when you finally see what you've spent your whole life ignoring. There's something powerful about realizing that what you need is not more information, not more action, but a new perception. Life doesn't become different when something outside changes. It becomes different when you access a part of yourself that was previously obscured. A space of presence that, for a long time, was drowned out by the voices of fear, doubt, and urgency. This shift in perception is like turning on a light in a room where you've lived for years in the dark. The furniture was always there, the doors, the windows, the possible paths. But in the absence of light, everything seemed narrow, threatening, limited. And that's how most people live, feeling their way through life, afraid to stumble, afraid to try something new, afraid to truly see what's there. But once the light is on, you no longer need to struggle to find the way. You simply see, and what is seen begins to transform. Because reality only needs a new gaze to begin to reorganize. This light is not external. It is born when you begin to observe with truth, when you stop running from what you feel, when you let go of trying to control everything with your mind, when you accept that pain is also part of the path, not as punishment, but as an invitation, and when you understand that reality is a reflection, not a sentence. The world is not telling you who you are, it's simply showing you what you're still identified with. Seeing this requires courage, because often what is revealed isn't pretty. It's parts of yourself you've denied, emotions you preferred to hide, stories that were never reinterpreted. But this revelation is liberating, because what is brought into the light loses its power over you. The shadow only imprisons while it remains ignored. This is the moment when transformation begins to take shape, when you no longer seek to run from yourself, but to draw closer, when you no longer try to defeat reality, but to understand it, when you stop asking for answers and begin to listen to what silence has to say. And from there, life starts responding differently. Synchronicities happen. Small coincidences reveal new paths. People who resonate with your new frequency begin to appear. Ideas arise effortlessly, and a subtle yet deep feeling emerges in your chest. Maybe, for the first time, you're in flow. What once seemed like resistance now reveals itself as redirection. What seemed like absence was only space being prepared for something more true. And what seemed like a block was just a reminder that the old way of seeing could no longer take you where your soul wants to go. None of this comes from the outside. It comes from the moment you begin to observe differently, not through effort, but through choice, not out of desperation, but out of presence, not by wanting to control, but by deciding to trust. Trusting that something greater is guiding everything. Trusting that even when nothing seems to make sense, There is an order that reveals itself as you align, trusting that you don't need to understand everything to begin moving. Just feel. Just allow yourself to see what was once ignored and welcome what arises with an open soul, because it is in that welcoming that true transformation is born, not as an event, but as a state of listening, of surrender, of alignment. A state where you no longer have to fight to create a new reality, because the new reality begins to form within, and what is born within, in truth, inevitably takes shape in the world, not as magic, but as a mirror. That's what changes everything. When you realize that transformation is not something you achieve, it's something you reveal. By looking within, with new eyes, and seeing what was always there, just waiting for your presence, you were never stuck. You were simply still looking at the world through the eyes of your old self. Reality doesn't repeat itself to punish you. It repeats because it still finds in you the same point of observation. But now, something has changed. You've seen the cycle. You've felt the pattern. And you've chosen to open a new space within. Life responds to what you silently sustain. And when the silence is one of presence, the response comes with synchronicity. What once seemed distant begins to draw near. Because it's not the world that needs to change. It's your gaze that needs to awaken. If this journey touched you in any way, write in the comments, "I saw the cycle, and now I choose the new." That tells me you were here until the end, and more than that, that something in you has already begun to move. We're in this crossing together, one gaze at a time,